coronavirus pandemic adaptation and planning via neuroscience and behavioral economics for IT professionals. This session is taught by Dr. Gleb Tuspersky, CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. Dr. Tuspersky is a world-renowned expert and thought leader with a mission in life to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors caused by cognitive biases. He has been featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews, including Inc. magazine, Entrepreneur, CBS News, Time, Business Insider, and Fast Company. Among his best-selling books include Never Go With Your Gut, Follow How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, and this and a second book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, among a lot of books that he's written. Personally, I'm a big fan of Dr. Tuspersky. I read The Truth Seeker's Handbook, which is available, by the way, as a free download if you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited. From his book, I learned that trusting your gut to make decisions may not be the best option in certain cases. So if you're the type of person who loves to make decisions by trusting gut decisions, then you'll find the seminar an eye-opening experience. For those of you attending this session, in order to obtain CPE credits, please pay close attention. You can receive a maximum of 2 CPs for attending this 2-hour webinar. Please answer poll questions as they appear at the beginning, middle, and end of the webinar as proof of your attendance. If you have any comments or questions regarding this webinar, you can email me at education@isacany.org. We would love to hear from you. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Tuspersky.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Wei.
Yep.
And I appreciate your personal endorsement of the book. I'm glad that you found it valuable.
I did really read it. You know, it's a great book.
I believe you, of course. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, let's go on. So we're going to start with I was asked to manage the poll questions. So we're going to start with the first question. Oh, thank you, Gerard. He asked whether I could have provided a copy of the book to the US president. I haven't, but you're welcome to ship it to the White House and to the name of our president. So we'll see what he says. So we'll start with the first question, the poll question. So again, these are just for the sake of attendance. For those who are looking to get CPE credits from attending today's presentation, please make sure to answer all the poll questions, especially, of course, the ones relevant to the CPE. So I will launch polling right now. And as you will see, you have the option of indicating whether you want to get CPEs for this session at all. So please indicate that. Make sure to vote in all the CPE questions. There will be, again, one at the beginning, one in the middle before the break, and one at the end. And there will be a break in this session. So we'll start right now, then the first part of the session will focus on the problems with our decision-making around the COVID-19 and adaptation and planning. Then then there will be some Q&A around that. Then the second half will focus on solving these problems. How do we address these problems? That will be the second half of the session. And then there will be a Q&A after that. So just so you know how the session will run. All right, I see we have 50 seconds in the poll. Not quite everyone voted. I'm going to give people 5 more seconds, so to have a full minute, and then we will move onward. All right, so that's, I presume, everyone who wants to get credits voted. All right, let's do that. Let's move onward. Great. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of adaptation planning is how very prominent leaders, very prominent business leaders, I'm not even talking about government leaders, I'm not even going into politics, but very prominent business leaders, whether new entrepreneurs in tech sector, industries, and so on, or old money, made really bad decision-making evaluations around COVID-19. We'll start with Elon Musk. And he's, of course, in the news right now for trying to get Tesla to the factories opened up quite a bit earlier before the California state government and local government would like him to do so. But he was not only at the forefront right now of pushing against the boundaries in COVID-19, he already was in early March saying that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And as you can see, this was on March 6th, so that this was a tweet from him on March 6th. Of course, at that time, the coronavirus was pretty much locking down northern Italy, and it was spreading widely in the US. So only a few days later, there was a declaration of emergency in the US about this being a very serious problem. But only a couple of days after the declaration of the emergency, Elon Musk tweeted and made another tweet saying that based on current trends, and this was on March 19th, based on current trends, probably close to zero new cases in the US by April. Well, unfortunately, we have over 1 million cases here in late May of COVID-19. So clearly Elon Musk got it wrong. And he's very prominent. You can see that he got 1.7 million likes for his statement that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And of course, over 100,000 retweets. He is very popular, very well known. A lot of people follow him, trust him, and go with his advice. Big problem for those people in adapting to the coronavirus pandemic, of course. Now, that's not only Elon Musk. Also, so he's new money. Old money got the estimates of the coronavirus situation very wrong in many situations as well, many cases as well. Let's go to old Goldman Sachs. Doesn't get more old money than Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, of course, is very focused on making estimates for their clients. They manage a lot of money, and their credibility to manage this money for their clients is dependent on making the right estimates of what the market will hold, of what the economy will hold. Because, of course, if they make the wrong estimate, then they will make bad investments and they will lose their clients quite a bit of money. So, with what happened with the U.S. With the estimate of the U.S. GDP in this growth in the second quarter by Goldman Sachs, we'll use that as a baseline for their accuracy of their estimates. They made an estimate on February 24th. February 24th was when several cities in northern Italy were already locked down. The coronavirus was spreading in the US. So they decreased their previous estimate of US GDP growth to 2.7%. They said the second quarter, the US GDP growth will be only 2.7%. Okay, so that was their estimate on February 24th. Now, only a few weeks later, 3 weeks later to be more exact, on March 15th, they made another estimate. So they revised their original estimate, which they do sometimes, and usually it's a revision within a couple of percentage point of a percentage. So 0.1% revision, 0.3% revision. But this was a 7.7% revision, going from 2.7% growth to a 5% decline. This is a huge change in their estimates. And so this is clearly a very bad estimate. Their clients clearly lost a lot of money who went with the estimate of Goldman Sachs and invested accordingly. But what happened only 5 days later? So look at what happened 5 days later on March 20th. They changed their estimate yet again. 5 days went from 5% decline to 24% decline. That's a 19% difference. I mean, imagine what happens if you have, all of your wealth, your money decreases by 19%. Then that's the impact of Goldman Sachs changing their estimates because, of course, their clients invest in accordance with Goldman Sachs evaluations. So the Goldman Sachs really screwed up. And of course, a lot of people were listening to Goldman Sachs. Some people trust new money like Elon Musk more. Some people trust old money like Goldman Sachs more. But in both cases, they're very trusted by a lot of people, a lot of business leaders, a lot of various sorts of leaders. As a result, most companies were really unprepared. Most leaders were really unprepared for the situation. They underestimated the threat. They really underestimated the problems associated with COVID-19. And they were caught unprepared for the pandemic. So what do? Well, they turned to their emergency business continuity plans. And I'm someone as a disaster avoidance expert. So that's my company is called Disaster Avoidance Experts. I'm the CEO of the company. There are 6 employees. We do a number of things, but one of the things we work on a lot for companies is disaster preparedness, business continuity plans. And I can tell you that business continuity plans are not a good fit for the situation. That's not what BCPs are about. That's not what the emergency plans are about. Now, they are a good fit for actual emergencies. Things like, let's say, a blizzard, or Hurricane Sandy hitting New York, right? Or Houston getting flooded. Now, imagine that that's a good fit for the situation. That's kind of a 1 week maybe interruption in a business, maybe a 2 week interruption in a business. But that's not what COVID-19 is about. COVID-19 is not an emergency. It's not that sort of right now we need to fix the problem. It will last for, a day or two or a week, maybe 2 weeks at most. That's not what it's about. It's like Hurricane Sandy sweeping into New York, flooding a lot of areas. And my parents' home. I grew up in New York City, so I went to NYU. That's my alma mater for my undergraduate degree. And my parents still live there. They live just outside of JFK, so I travel there occasionally, well, before COVID-19, to visit them. And their house was flooded by Hurricane Sandy. They couldn't grow anything because of the salt water in their backyard. So that was pretty bad. And I'm sure a lot of you suffered as well with Hurricane Sandy. Well, imagine if Hurricane Sandy happened, but the floodwaters didn't recede. So if New York got flooded and then stayed flooded, that's what COVID-19 is about. It's not an emergency. It's a major disruptor, one that really seriously makes our world much worse. It's a slow-moving, high-impact, long-term threat. That is what COVID-19 is. And business continuity plans are not a good fit for the situation because they're made for a sprint. That's what they're made for. But we're dealing with a marathon. This relying on these business continuity plans leads to serious problems. Let's talk about the facts about COVID-19 to understand and get on the same page about what is the actual reality of the situation. It's highly contagious. It's very contagious. So without any intervention, every person who's infected infects 2 to 3 others. That's kind of what the recent research on it shows. The number of cases without suppression, without intervention, doubles every 3 to 6 days. That means that it's a hockey stick shape, so it increases logarithmically, it increases very quickly. There's a risk of a serious illness associated with it. About 10 to 20% of all people who get COVID-19 get seriously ill. And this includes the asymptomatic people. So you've probably heard that some people are asymptomatic. Some people never show symptoms. Some people show symptoms later. But something like 40 to 50% of the people who have COVID-19 at any time are asymptomatic. And many of them don't show any symptoms at all. So of those, we have, let's say, half of the people who don't show symptoms. Of the rest of the people, there are 30 to 40% who have moderate flu-like symptoms, various levels of seriousness. And then of the rest, so there are something like 10 to 20% left, that's the 10 to 20% who get seriously ill. And about half of those require hospitalization. And I know this from experience within my family. So I told you that my parents still live in JFK. My dad's 79, and he about 6 weeks ago, he started getting seriously ill with coughing, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, smell. Those are the classical symptoms, not the coughing, but shortness of breath and loss of appetite and smell. That's associated with COVID-19, less so with other flu-like conditions called influenza. So he ended up being pretty sick, increasingly sick. My mom, fortunately, has medical training. So she's a psychiatrist. She was able to provide him with support at home that would minimize the likelihood of him getting pneumonia. And that is the big, serious consequence. What kills most people is getting pneumonia as a result of COVID-19. So she was working on him, putting him in doing various massages, various things to prevent him from getting pneumonia because she really didn't want him to go to the hospital. I mean, you're all in New York City, you know what the scenes of hospitals were like. That was pretty bad. She was scared of him going to the hospital. And she was fortunately able to pull him through. There were several days when she was thinking that he really needed to go to the hospital. It was just kind of on the edge, but he eventually started improving. So right now he's on the long road to recovery. He's still, he's still pretty not great. He finds it difficult to walk. Previously he walked daily for something like an hour. He has a lot of difficulty walking. He has a lot of difficulty breathing. So he still coughs a lot if he takes deep breaths, but at least he's much better than he used to be. So I'm really relieved. So he's on the mend. But that is something that I experienced in my family as well. And of course, we know we have mortality from it. It's much more deadly than the flu. Of all people who get COVID-19, including people who are asymptomatic, at the lowest bound, 0.5% to the higher bound of 1% die. So 0.5 to 1% die, that's various estimates, various studies. That's what we know. And it has a much higher death rate for people like my dad who are over 60, or people with underlying health conditions, whether it's asthma, whether it's really bad allergies, whether it's diabetes, whether it's smoking, various underlying health conditions. And we don't have any effective treatment. So that is a big problem. You might have heard of remdesivir. Now, that is the only drug that has been shown to be actually somewhat effective against COVID-19 without serious other side effects, which are more problematic than COVID-19. But what that does is, according to the latest research, it decreases hospital stays. So on average, someone needs to stay in the hospital for 15 days to recover from COVID-19. Remdesivir takes that down to around 11 days. So it's no way a magic bullet. It would be great if we can get that with decreased morbidity. It might also decrease mortality. We don't know that. Morbidity refers to sickness, mortality refers to death. It decreases morbidity, but by about something like just under 30%. So which is great, but it's no way silver bullet, and we don't know whether it decreases mortality. And you might have heard of the malaria drug. What we know about that is that it might have some consequence. It likely slightly decreases COVID-19 consequences, health risks, problems, the virus load associated with COVID-19, but it has many other side effects, especially for around heart attacks, which make it overall more dangerous for someone with COVID-19 or without to be taking this drug to address COVID-19. So not great. Vaccine as our only solution. Let's just be very clear about that. This is the only real solution that we have to COVID-19. It's the only effective solution. Human trials for a vaccine. Now, if we throw all the money at it and cut all the red tape, which we're doing, they need to test safety and effectiveness anyway. So the first set of trials, you probably hear about them as phase 1 trials. They test safety. And that takes about 4 months or so, because you need some time after you inject someone with a vaccine to see whether they develop consequences. So that 4 months is enough time to do the study, evaluate whether someone has consequences couple of months down the road, and then evaluate do all the data number crunching kind of. And that's about 4 months. Then you need to have a couple of rounds of trials to test the effectiveness. Does somebody develop antibodies for COVID-19 when you inject them with a vaccine? Then are the antibodies sufficient to protect them from getting infected with COVID-19? That's the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So you'll probably hear of them in those vaccines. That takes about the shortest period. If you condense everything down, overlap trials with each other, takes about 8 months or so to do those, and then evaluate the results. So altogether, if we just throw all the money at it, cut all the red tape, takes at least a year, 4 plus 8 months, as opposed to the usual 4 to 5 years. So that's kind of how long a usual trial takes place. Now, unfortunately, and you probably heard about this, most vaccines don't make it through human trials. Maybe something about 5% of all vaccines make it through human trials, 5 to 10%, because it's hard to make a vaccine that is sufficiently safe, so it doesn't have lots of negative side effects, than ones that are sufficiently effective. That's a big problem. So that's why it's really difficult. And the first wave of COVID-19 vaccines that are in trials right now, there are about 8 in trials right now, 10 going to be in trials in a couple of months. Those were rushed into production naturally, appropriately. They were quite rushed into production. But the consequence of that is that COVID-19, you've probably heard about COVID-19 mutating. And the problem with the mutation is that we don't know whether the original vaccines, so the vaccines that were aimed to address the original strain, whether they'll be sufficient for the new strains, Often the vaccine production doesn't take off immediately from when you spot a virus. You wait for it to mutate, you see a variety of strains so that you make sure that the vaccine that you create hits a variety of strains of the new virus. And the first batch of vaccines don't. They only aim at the first strain that was discovered. Hopefully, they'll be effective against other strains of COVID-19 that are mutating, but we don't know that. So it's unlikely that the first trials will be successful. It's unlikely that they'll be successful, just the reality of the situation. Likely it will take a second batch of vaccines, maybe ones that are produced and go into trials next year rather than this year, or even later. And after the vaccine is ready, what happens is that the government needs to coordinate the process of producing the vaccine, distributing it, and actually vaccinating people, and of course, fighting the anti-vaxxers. So that's another component of what needs to happen. Just having the vaccine is not really helpful because you need to do all these other steps. So that's what we're facing. Here are the possible timelines, and this is the reality of the situation. We have an optimistic timeline. That's what you've been hearing from everybody. Some are way too optimistic, unrealistically optimistic, but some, like Anthony Fauci, do have that more optimistic, and Bill Gates, optimistic, realistic timeline. There's a moderate timeline, and this is what the reality of the situation is, most likely to be moderate, and there's a pessimistic timeline. Let's talk about the optimistic timeline. This would be great if it happens. Approved for mass production by summer of 2021. That's the year-long process. That's assuming that one of the vaccines that's in the first batch is actually good enough, which again, there's not that likely. Then production, distribution, vaccination. Now, we're at a high level of government competence. And government, as you know, the US government, the federal government at least, has not shown a high level of competence. It's been really not very competent in producing enough tests for COVID-19, which we still don't have enough tests. Of course, it would have been great if they had enough tests early in the infection process, early in the pandemic process. We would have been much better able to control it. Now, in order to open up the economy, at least you need tests, but we don't have nearly enough, not nearly as much as we need. And personal protective equipment. We still don't have enough personal protective equipment for everyone who needs it. We don't have that. And that's been a big problem, that the federal government has not done a great job at all on those areas and other areas. So if we assume that the federal government is somehow going to become excellently, wonderfully competent, this process of production, distribution, vaccination is going to take 6 months. That way, most people will be vaccinated, at least people who are in the more vulnerable categories, people over 60, like my dad, or people with autoimmune conditions, who are under 60 with various health risks, health challenges, that they'll be vaccinated by early 2022.
By the way, Dr. Kaspersky, we have a question regarding the presentation, it being shared to participants. Are we sharing this presentation at all with is that like a formal, I believe like Chen is asking for maybe a formal slide deck, or?
I'll be happy to share a recording to anyone who wants.
Okay, beautiful, thanks. Yep. Hopefully it answers your question, Chen.
All right, so in the most optimistic scenario, and thank you for asking the question, Wei. In the most optimistic scenario, we will have mass vaccination of at least the most vulnerable categories, not killing grandma, that's definitely an important goal, by early 2022. That's the most optimistic scenario. It's very optimistic. So there's a less than 5% likelihood of this happening. The very optimistic, this is the reality of the situation because of everything I described earlier. So let's go on to the moderate scenario. This is the scenario that's most likely to happen. This is much more realistic. We'll have a moderate timeline. Now, it's going to be approved for mass production sometime by, let's say, ranging from anywhere from 2022 to 2025, with a midpoint of 2023. So that's when the vaccine will be approved for mass production. That assumes that one of the next batches, let's say a second wave of vaccines that's approved, that's created next year, will then take another year to go through the trials and be approved by 2022. Or the third wave that will be approved by 2023 or the fourth wave will be approved by 24, and so on. So that's kind of that range. Then we're not assuming a high level of government competence, but let's say a moderate level of government competence, somewhat more competent than the government showed with providing tests and personal protective equipment. It'll take a year. Production, distribution, vaccination for at least the most vulnerable categories. So most people will be vaccinated in this moderate scenario by 2024. This is the most likely scenario. I'd say it's a 70% chance likelihood that this will be a range from time from 22 to 26 with a midpoint of most people vaccinated by 2024. There's also, unfortunately, the pessimistic scenario. And this is the reality of the situation that we can't prevent the pessimistic scenario no matter how much we want because of the biology. We don't know enough about the biology of COVID-19 to prevent a pessimistic scenario. In that case, it might be approved for mass production by 2026, so later than that, so anywhere from 26 to 2030, if we are really unlucky. Then production, distribution, vaccination with a moderate level of government competence takes a year. And so most people will be vaccinated, at least the ones with the most vulnerable categories, by 2027. That is, I'd say, 25% likelihood. Now, you might think that this is too cynical, too negative, too pessimistic, but I'm not sure that you know that, but we still don't have an effective vaccine against the flu. Our vaccine against the flu is only 50% effective. So if it turns out that COVID-19 is more difficult to vaccinate against than we expect and hope and desire, that's when the timeline would move into that direction, into this negative direction. And we already have some potential indicators that it's more pessimistic than we would like. So for example, you've probably heard that some people who are infected with COVID-19 might be getting reinfected. We don't know whether they're actually getting reinfected fully with the same strain, with other strains. Maybe it might be the remnants of the virus getting reactivated, but it's possible that they're getting reinfected, which would not be a good sign for COVID-19. Immunity would not be a good sign for vaccination, for effective vaccination. So this is a problem. These are the possible timelines. Now, this is not easy for me to hear, for you to hear, for me to talk about, but the reality of the situation is that we only have the tool of suppression. Suppression is our only tool to deal with COVID-19. This is the only thing that we have available right now. It's our only option, unfortunately, at least for non-authoritarian societies. In Wuhan and various other areas of China and some other authoritarian societies, the government was able to put chains on people's doors, chains and locks on people's doors, and make people download an app on their smartphone which traces all their movements. That's not really a possibility here in the US. So we can't do that. And the government, unfortunately, has not been good enough in the US, the federal government, to enable what happened in South Korea. Now, South Korea is a democratic country, but what it did, the central government moved very fast to do testing, mass widespread testing, and then contact tracing of people who had found to be sick with COVID-19, isolating them, getting their contacts who had COVID-19, who were exposed to them, into quarantine. And as a result, so South Korea has a population of 60 million people, the US has a population of 330 million people. COVID-19 was discovered in both countries on the same day, literally on the same day. Now, the US has about 94,000 deaths of COVID-19 by today. South Korea has under 300 deaths of COVID-19. So, if we had the same population as, if South Korea had the same population as we do, it would have something like under 1,500 deaths versus over 93,000 deaths that we have. It's tragic, but this is the reality of the situation. The government did not move nearly fast enough. And it's not simply about South Korea being in Southeast Asia and being more aware, being in East Asia, being more aware of the problems associated with respiratory diseases. There are a number of countries in the Western world which moved much faster than the US. So for example, Germany is a good case study. It has a population of over 80 million, and it's very comparable to the US in terms of being very geographically diverse, being very culturally diverse, having a lot of tensions and issues that South Korea doesn't have quite as much of these sorts of tensions and diversity. But Germany did a very good contact tracing and isolation process. So there. And they had, of course, more problems than the US in terms of being connected to the rest of the EU and having people from other countries in the EU come into Germany and go out of Germany. So they had more vulnerability in that regard, whereas the US was able to much more easily lock its borders and so on. But what happened with Germany, with extensive contact tracing and isolation early onward, testing contact tracing and isolation, they only had 7,000 deaths, I think 8,000 by now, so just over 8,000 deaths versus, again, the 94,000 deaths in the US. So for comparable populations, Germany would have had something like 25,000 deaths instead of the 94,000 deaths that the US has. So we're all dealing with shutdowns in order to restrict COVID-19, flatten the curve, you've heard that, in order to decrease the number of transmissions, and social distancing, combination of social distancing. So you probably heard that 6 feet is the minimal. The research shows that 10 feet is actually much better, because 6 feet is really super minimal, but really you want to aim for 10 feet. And something that the more recent research has shown, I'm not sure how much it has been trickled down into popular consciousness, is that indoor spaces, even the 10 feet distance doesn't really help much, because in indoor spaces, the air circulates. So there are a number of studies showing that, let's say, people seated at different ends in a restaurant, different kind of corners in the restaurant, really far from each other. But if somebody has COVID-19 at one corner of the restaurant, then if the people at the other corner of the restaurant sit there long enough, I think it was a study of it was about an hour and a half. So about half of the people at a table at the other corner of the restaurant got COVID-19, because somebody who had COVID-19 was sitting in another corner of the restaurant. In another study, it was evaluating an office space environment. So somebody in an office who had COVID-19, they were sitting in cubicles, open cubicles, but far away from other people. So there was around 40 people in the office, and the office was separated into two areas. So one on one side, one on the other side. The area around the person, of the people, 20-ish people who were around him, the large majority got sick, and they were not, they were quite a bit further than 10 feet. Some of them were 30, 40, 50 feet in office spaces, because they were there from 9 to 5. So the 10 feet doesn't really save you if you are in an enclosed environment for a long time. That's why social distancing is not nearly as good as it appears. So that's why shutdowns are also necessary restrictions. Otherwise, if we don't have these, hospitals will get overwhelmed. And as we've seen from northern Italy, as we've seen from areas in Washington State, Oregon, and of course, New York City, as I'm sure you know very well, what happens in those sorts of situations is that death rates shoot up by tenfold, because all the people who would be hospitalized, the 5 to 10% of people who would be hospitalized, then of those 5 to 10% of the people who are hospitalized, about 10% die, so 0.5 to 1% of the total. But the death rate shoots up to all the people who would be hospitalized, basically, so about 10 times. So in Italy, that's what happened. The overwhelmed hospitals resulted in something like a death rate of 12%. So it's slightly over the higher bound, because Italy's population tends to be older overall than the US or average populations. So it would be 5 to 10% death rate if hospitals are allowed to get overwhelmed. And suppression is extremely costly. We know that. It's extremely economically costly. It's costly in other areas of mental and physical health, but it's effective. We know it's effective. Cases have gone down in New York, in other areas that have had actually effective suppression. And as I mentioned, but we need to realize the several countries that have successfully reduced their COVID-19 for aggressive suppression. What happens after that, after the aggressive suppression? Well, then they're opening up. They have loosening of restrictions. the number of cases increased in South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, other countries, Germany, and as a result, they had to impose more tight restrictions again. And that's what will happen here in the US. There's no question that that's what we're dealing with. This waves. So we're dealing with waves of looser restrictions, which we're going through right now. States overwhelmingly are loosening the restrictions, and there's an increase in cases. There can't not be, as shown by the examples of other countries, and as is already happening in several states in the US. Then eventually, in most states, and I don't necessarily say that it will be all states, but in most states, there will be again tighter restrictions because the large majority of governors will not let the death rate in their state shoot up by 10 times, from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%. I mean, even setting aside the ethical, moral, human dimensions of it, it looks very bad on TV to have refrigerator trucks full of bodies, the opposite party, whatever it happens to be, the party out of power, the party which doesn't support the governor, saying it's the governor's fault because the governor should have imposed tighter restrictions. That does not look good politically. So the large majority of cases, that won't happen. And so tighter restrictions will result in a decrease of cases and a loosening of restrictions again. And that's what we're dealing with, these repeating waves of tighter cases, looser cases, tighter cases, looser cases, and various levels of social distancing until that's addressed. So this, as I mentioned, the COVID-19 is not a short-term emergency. This is not something that we can easily deal with. It's a major disruption. And it's something that will be around even in the most optimistic scenario. The vaccine won't be widely available until 2022. So that's what we have to deal with. The world will change forever. It's just going to be very much changed. These waves of restrictions, they'll change people's habits, they'll change people's norms, values, expectations, desires. We'll never go back to January 2020. The world is fundamentally shifted, disrupted by COVID-19. So think about your role as a trusted advisor here. As an ISACA member, you are in IT roles, auditing roles, security roles. You are a trusted advisor to the leadership of the organization. So your role as a trusted advisor is to help the leadership of the organization face this reality. Empower them to realize the extent of this major disruption. That's what your role is. They are going to be way too optimistic. And I know this, I'm running a consulting, coaching, and training firm. I work with leaders all the time. They are way too optimistic in most of them. I mean, you saw even Goldman Sachs was too optimistic. And of course, Elon Musk was too optimistic. Right now, so many of them want to get back to normal. That's what they really want. And you need to help them prepare for the uncomfortable reality that they're facing. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard to get over the hump of getting them prepared for the tough reality that we're facing. But by helping them, you will help them accomplish their leadership goals, and they'll, of course, be grateful to you. So you'll help them accomplish their goals, and you'll build their trust in you as a trusted advisor. So that's going to be beneficial, of course, for you and them going down the road. I want to encourage you to not plan for the optimistic scenario. There are too many companies. They act as though the problem will blow over soon. They act as though they can go back to normal. Hope is not a strategy. It's a really good quote by Vince Lombardi, or attributed at least to Vince Lombardi. And I want you to be thinking about this quote as you go forward, as you think about the way that we deal with COVID-19. You want to prepare for the moderate or pessimistic scenario instead. This is what you need to be prepared for. Now, if you take a look, there will be another poll. And I want to ask you, how well prepared is your organization for the moderate scenario? So take a look at that. How well prepared is your organization for the moderate scenario? Needs some improvement, we're all set, or it'll take a lot of work? Please go ahead. I see that about 85% of all people voted, so we're still waiting for a few folks to vote. I'm going to give 5 more seconds before finishing the poll. All right, let's take a look at the results. So you should be all seeing the results, and you'll see that about 15% of you, their companies are all prepared for the moderate scenario. So being in 2024, the end of COVID-19 being 2024. That's great. I'm glad that you're prepared. That's excellent. That's wonderful. Most people, the 61%, so 3/5, need some improvement. And we'll talk about ways of improving it in the second half. We haven't gotten through all the problems, so we're still talking about decision-making problems, but we'll talk about how to improve these areas in the second half. But part of the improvement will be awareness of the decision-making problems, challenges we'll experience as human beings. And 25% of you said it'll take a lot of work. That's great that you realize that. I mean, it's going to definitely, for many companies, it'll take a lot of work. So you need to be prepared for that. All right. Let's go on to talking about a little bit more about the nature of the pandemic. It's a slow-moving threat, and we make very bad decisions about such slow-moving threats. That's just our nature. We are not great at making such decisions. The threats that are unusual, that are slow-moving, our brain is not wired to make good decisions about them. Our gut reactions tend to greatly underestimate such threats. And that leads to decisions that endanger our businesses, that endanger our organizations. A little bit about me so that you know, here is where my area of expertise lies. The kind of decisions we make, how to manage such risks, how to make better decisions and make more effective strategic plans. So I'll talk about my experience, clients, media, and books. My experience, I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. It's a boutique consulting, coaching, and training company. Now, for myself, I've had 20 years of helping clients in disaster avoidance of various sorts, risk management, strategic planning, decision-making. I've also spent 15 years in academia, including as a professor, 7 years as a professor at Ohio State, previously a fellow at UNC Chapel Hill, and I published in a whole bunch of peer-reviewed venues, prominent venues like Behavior and Social Issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, and many others. That's my experience. Clients, I've worked with a whole variety of clients, from innovative startups to Fortune 500 companies, ranging from Aflac to Xerox. So lots of various companies with a number of industries, heavy in technology. Media. So I've appeared in a wide variety of media, as Wayne mentioned, Inc., Fast Company, Scientific American, CBS News, NPR, Newsweek, CNBC, Time. Those are just 8. I have over 550 articles published and 450 interviews. And finally, books. I published 4 best-selling books. Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. That focuses on business decision-making, professional decision-making, career decision-making, financial decision-making. Then The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Bias and Build Better Relationships. That focuses on relationships, professional and personal, effective communication, problem resolution, and so on. Then what Wayne mentioned, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide. It focuses on how to see reality clearly and help others do so in the context of preventing bad decisions. And finally, a book that's just published, literally out on May 15th, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. And of course, this presentation is based on this book. So that's a little bit about me. Now, why is bad advice about decision-making common? Because we suffer from dangerous judgment errors. And that is what cognitive neuroscientists and behavioral economists like myself, that's my expertise, calls cognitive biases. They come from our evolutionary background, the way that we evolved and the result of how we feel, how we experience life, and how our brains are wired, the structure of our brains. Of course, those two are intertwined. We evolved for the savanna environment when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. We're hunter-gatherers and foragers. That's our nature. So that is how we feel and experience things when we go with our gut, when we trust our intuitions, when we're primal, savage, blink, whatever your flavor of the same thing is. That's what most people advise us to do, the vast majority actually advise us to do in following our intuitions, going with our gut. And that is a big problem, because our main response to threats in the modern environment is the fight or flight response. That's what it was in the savanna environment, still is in the modern environment. It was great for hunter-gatherers and ancient hunter-gatherers. The risks they faced were immense, intense, in the immediate, in the moment. That's like saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of the saber-toothed tiger response when we have to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. Now, that was great in the savanna environment, but much more problematic in the mother environment. You might notice there are many less saber-toothed tigers around. The risks we face are more complex, more ambiguous, more uncertain. They're much more likely to come from reading a news story about, buried in the back pages of a newspaper or very down low in, an online venue about some backwoods city in China, Wuhan, China. Who heard of it, right? Well, I don't know how much you know about Wuhan, but it's actually a major metropolis. It has over 11 million people. It produces over $22 billion in revenue. It has something like 50 international flights a day, so carrying something like 10,000 people in and out of Wuhan, China. It's called the Chicago of China, so it's really a major metropolis. And they come from our cell phone, when we get emails, notifications, messages, and so on. That's the kind of risks we face. And there are three particularly dangerous judgment errors that we need to be aware of for COVID-19. Normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. And it's not simply for COVID-19, it's for a whole variety of major slow-moving train wrecks, like the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009. That's another example that very much impacted our lives in very negative ways, and we did not, and most people, the vast majority of people, didn't anticipate it. So it's normalcy bias. Well, in the savanna environment, it was a safe assumption that the future will be much like today. So if somebody told us that the future will be different, we should not believe them. That was a bad idea to believe them. And we still have that intuition that the future will be much like today. I mean, if you think of yourself in the future, 5 years from now, what do you imagine yourself to be? You probably imagine yourself as some version of yourself, maybe a little bit aged, maybe a little bit wiser. But if you think of yourself 5 years back, you'll probably realize what a different person you were 5 years in the past. Think about yourself 5 years in the past. Now, why don't we realize that we might be just as different 5 years from now as we were 5 years ago? That's not something that's intuitive to us. And it's just an example of the normalcy bias. We assume that everything will keep going normally, that things will follow the same patterns, the same trends. And that leads us to greatly underestimate the impact of major disruptors, the impact and the likelihood, because we forecast a short-term future based on the short-term past. So that's a big problem for our thinking, the normalcy bias. Then the planning fallacy, another big one. Now, we tend to be very confident about ourselves and our plans. We like ourselves and our plans, and we assume that the future will go according to whatever plans we make. You might have heard of the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. Planning to fail is failing to plan. Planning to fail, failing to plan is planning to fail. So again, failing to plan is planning to fail. That's a very common phrase. People use it a lot. Unfortunately, it's quite misleading because it assumes that once you make a plan, things will go according to plan. That's actually not going to be very frequent. When I talk to my clients, I very strongly encourage them to use a different phrase. Failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. So again, failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. That's a much more effective phrase. And that gets us to really understand that we need to focus on problems and risks much more than seems intuitive to us. And we tend to underestimate the resources that we need to solve them, whether time, money, information, social capital. There was an interesting study of major computer projects. It evaluated that of all major computer projects, so let's say database implementation or website launch, major website revision, website launch, whole bunch of IT projects, about only 14% go according to plan. So only 14% go according to the budget estimate. They stay within the budget estimate and the time estimate, the original budget estimate and time estimate. That means that 86% don't. Of those that don't, about over 100, the rest go over time and budget by about 159%. So this is for major projects, of course. Big example of the planning fallacy not working out well for IT folks. Hyperbolic discounting. This is the last one that I want to highlight. In the savanna environment, it was very important for us to be in the moment, short-term oriented. So let's say when we killed the mammoth, we couldn't freeze the meat. That was not something that we should do. So it was that we could do. So it was very important for us to eat as much of it as possible in the moment, right there. Not leave anything for the future. Seize the moment. That's carpe diem. That's great, but that's not what the reality is of today. Today, we can actually freeze the meat. We can choose to not spend all our money, but save it, put it in a bank, invest it into the future. We can invest in our professional development instead of sitting home and watching Netflix all day. Like, fortunately, you are doing, investing in your professional development by attending this session. And of course, we can make sure that our companies are going to make plans for the long term. And that's unfortunately something that's very hard to us because we're very tempted to sacrifice our long-term future by prioritizing the short term. And we underestimate the long-term outcomes and impacts of doing so. So these are 3 cognitive biases that are especially problematic for COVID-19. And now I want to do another poll. So if you take a look at your polling options, I want to ask which of these dangerous judgment errors might be the biggest challenge for your organization. So please go ahead and take a look at the polls and vote in the polls. Which of them might be the biggest danger for your organization? We have 67% of the people who voted, so let's get those numbers up. We have 85% of the people voting, so give people around 5 more seconds. Great. So take a look at the results. What we see is that there are 2 that are winning out. The planning fallacy is the biggest one. So planning fallacy, focusing on where people don't realize the kind of disruptions that might happen to their plans, and they don't actually make good plans for the future. They make too optimistic, too idealistic plans, don't plan sufficiently for problems and risks, and don't account for all the resources that they'll actually need. That's the biggest one. Close behind that is the normalcy bias, underestimating large major disruptors like COVID-19. Of course, the problem with COVID-19 is that it makes other major disruptors, unusual things worse. You've probably seen in the headlines about the floods in Michigan, for once in a 500-year situation flood, right? Unfortunately, climate change is making those much more frequent. So you'll see that previous floods and hurricanes and so on that are called once in a century are happening every several years, even more frequently. And that combines pretty poorly with an ongoing disaster, ongoing catastrophe like COVID-19, because right now in Michigan, they're having trouble getting people into shelters. They're trying to figure out how do you get people into shelters without having them inviting someone who has COVID-19, getting everybody in the shelter sick. So these things exacerbate each other. We have more challenges with normalcy bias than we would be at other times if we don't have COVID-19. And finally, hyperbolic discounting. So about 20% highlight hyperbolic discounting, focusing too much on the short term, not nearly enough on the long term as a major problem. Great. Let's go on to talking about how to overcome these dangerous judgment errors. Now, you need to go against your intuitions. Our intuitions evolved to help early human beings survive. That's what they're for. That's what they're about. Our gut reactions, our intuitions, especially then, your intuitions, the intuitions of the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor. We're not wired for making decisions in today's complex world, unfortunately, but people still tend to very much trust their gut for going with these decisions. Now, the problem is you probably know already some areas where you don't trust your gut. Think about what happens when somebody leaves a dozen donuts in the break room. It's very tempting to eat more than you should. Maybe you probably shouldn't have more than 1 donut, maybe 2 at most, but you got to stop at the 3rd donut. But it's very hard. Once we have one donut, we're triggered by sugar and we want to have more and more. Or let's say, think about ice cream, that gallon of ice cream. Now you got that gallon of ice cream. What's the serving size? Half a cup. Check it out, look it up. It's half a cup. who eats half a cup of ice cream? Now, how is it possible to eat? I have no idea how it's possible to eat half a cup of ice cream. You start eating it, and then you eat a third of the gallon, or maybe more. That's a problem, and that is a problem with how our gut reactions are wired. Our brain is wired. We're very tempted to eat sugar because in the savanna environment, when they came across a source of sugar, honey, apples, bananas, it was important for us to eat as much of it as possible. It was bananas not to. It was really important for us to do that. And we are the descendants of those who were successful at doing so, who were strongly triggered by sugar and who ate as much of it as they could. The people who didn't do that didn't survive and thrive and reproduce to give their genes onto us. We're also the descendants of those who had a great fight or flight reflex because the other ones were actually caught by the saber-toothed tiger. And so we still have that fight or flight reflex. We still have that sugar triggering reflex when we instead, what we should be having is a bowl of sugar, is a bowl, instead of those donuts, is a bowl of fruit. That's a much healthier dessert. Now, fortunately, we can figure out that, hey, when we start eating donuts, we're going to keep eating all of them. So you can develop those mental habits and say that, well, there's a box of donuts here in the break room table, but I got a fruit salad I took from home. Maybe I'll just go and have the fruit salad. And that's the kind of habits that you've already instituted for your physical self, for your physical health, for your physical fitness. But unfortunately, the large majority of us don't take care of our mental fitness. We pay a lot of attention to our physical fitness with a good diet and exercise and so on, which are very counterintuitive. Neither having a healthy diet nor exercises, those are not intuitive at all. They go against our intuitions. We have to build up habits instead of sitting on our couch and watching Netflix all day to do exercises and to not have the donuts, but to have fruit. You need to do the same in order to have good mental fitness, making good decisions, and help the leaders for whom you're a trusted advisor make good decisions. So how you can prepare is to make long-term changes to your plans. And by that I also mean that whether your organization, your career, you need to make long-term changes to your plans, thinking years and not weeks. All right, at this point, I'll take some questions on the first part of the presentation, and then we'll have a brief break before going on to the second part, about which we'll get more in depth into how to prepare. I'll ask you to chat your questions into the chat box. So please chat the questions that you want into the chat box.
So Dr. Tuspersky, I just sent you a question from a Stuart Palkowitz. He mentioned, do you see government passing law blocking or reducing liability of pharmacy industry to lawsuits, or provide government reimbursement in case of lawsuits / class action?
We already know that some states have passed it. I believe New York is either finished passing it or just about to pass it to protect a number of healthcare organizations. Should probably include the pharmacy industry and so on from COVID-19 liability. That in New York, the state, likely it will be broadened to include most businesses, if not all, from COVID-19 liability. Now, more broadly, if you are in a company that's more federal, there's certainly what I've seen from the political discussions is that the Republicans very much want that law to be part of the next stimulus bill, and that might well happen. I don't know, I'm not such an astute political observer that I can predict whether the Democrats and the Republicans will actually agree on the next stimulus. Hopefully they will. So I'd say there's maybe something like a 75% chance likelihood of liability protection, but I certainly can't guarantee it, and you should only assume that there's a 75% chance likelihood, so in terms of going forward. Other questions on the problems in our decision making on these moderate scenarios before we do a break?
So Dr. Tuspersky, I guess we need to do our poll right now, right?
Yep.
I think, okay.
Yeah, I wanted to wait to see if there's any more questions before doing the poll.
Okay, sure, beautiful. Mm-hmm.
All right, there don't seem to be any questions about that. Let's go on to do the poll. This is for getting CPEs for the first half of this session. So please respond in the poll of whether you want to get CPEs for the first half of the session. And after you respond, you're welcome to take a 10-minute break. So we'll be back at, it's 2:03 right now on my clock, so we'll start at 2:14. See you then. We'll be restarting in a minute, everyone. All right, good. I hope everyone is back. Well, no, it's still not quite 2:14. It's still not quite 2:14. I'll give people just one more minute. I want to be fair to those people. All right, great. So let's go on talking about how to exactly you can prepare for COVID-19 for your organization. Let's start talking about the steps that you can take to prepare. And this applies to businesses and other organizations. You want to make fundamental changes to your business model, organizational model if you're not a business. For the future, really focus on virtual interactions. That's what's going to get you ahead in the future. You don't want to yo-yo back between office building and home, office building and home. That's not a good approach to the future, because what so many people are not realizing, they really want to go back to normal and so on, and they're going back to the office. They're not realizing that, in several months they'll need to go back home when there will be a tightening of restrictions. Just that's the reality of the situation in the large majority of the country, where their governors will not want death rates to shoot up by 10 times to five of COVID-19 to 5 to 10% when their hospitals get overwhelmed and have the bad visuals. They'll have restrictions, so they'll have to go back home. I strongly encourage you to, as a trusted advisor to your supervisors, to your leaders, organizations, to make a commitment to virtual teams and offerings. Just make that commitment. One that's really helpful step is consider ending the real estate lease or selling real estate. This is actually a really great time to sell commercial real estate, because soon people realize how bad off commercial real estate will be, that it's going to be in a really bad, sucky place, because more and more people realize that there's going to be another wave of restrictions, and most people don't. So people are still buying commercial real estate. So if you have commercial real estate, it's a great time to sell, much better than it will be in the future. Or end your office space lease if you have office space lease. It'll be, I mean, my clients who are breaking their office space lease contracts, there's just 2 months. You get the first month and the last month, and you break the contract. That's, I mean, you'll save so much money going forward if you end that office space lease. You can always use co-working spaces if you really need to have a face-to-face meeting, but in the vast majority of cases, you won't be. It's much easier to have a virtual team than many people think there is. But what you need to do in order for virtual teams is to change your internal and external organizational model, your business model, while focusing on cybersecurity, 6 areas: cybersecurity, motivation, engagement, effective communication, resolving conflicts, cultivating trust, and accountability. Well, cybersecurity, I'm sure that's something that pretty much all ISACA members are aware of. I'm just going to highlight this in case you show this to your supervisors and want them to make sure that this is an important area to think about. Those working from home are much more vulnerable to cyber attacks. This is the reality of the situation. There are a number of reasons. First of all, they're not used to following the cybersecurity protocols at home. We are reminded by our environment of how to behave. That's the behavioral science in this question, that we kind of make judgments based on the framing of what's around us. And employees are not used to following cybersecurity protocols at home. And the FBI has already seen a high uptick in the number of hacks. You need to improve cybersecurity by training, by providing training for people and also funding for them to improve their home security, their laptops and so on. Everything like that. You need to provide training and funding. This is an area of these two things, training and funding. Then motivation engagement. Now, this is something for you to be aware of. Before the pandemic, how many of all employees do you think were fully engaged, meaning active, engaged, creative, problem solving, passionate about the organization? According to Gallup surveys done every year, only 34%. 34% of all employees. Most people over high in the high 50s percents are disengaged, passive. They are just punching the clock, doing the bare minimum they need to get by and not get fired, and kind of slowly proceed up the chain if they do that, or at least stay where they are, and leaving at the first available opportunity. Then about 15% or so are actively disengaged. They are hostile to the organization. They are bad-mouthing. They're looking for a new place. They're willing to steal and cheat and so on. Not great. Working from home does not help with engagement. The first several weeks, people are much more committed. They are rallying around the flag, so to speak, with the situation with COVID-19. But over time, that initial enthusiasm, that emergency mode, the business continuity plan, that fades. And the reality of working from home kicks in, where people are not getting the motivation that they used to from being surrounded by other employees. We're very tribal creatures. That's the nature of who we are as human beings. So we are very much used to being influenced by others around us. That's a problem for us in helping us make good decisions and be as motivated as we want to be when people surrounding us are our family instead of other employees. There's also the stress of adjusting to life in the pandemic, from everything from being quarantined and not being able to do the fun stuff that you used to do, which of course decreases engagement, motivation, life energy, to your family being at home as opposed to being where they hopefully should be, spending 24/7 with your significant other, getting on each other's nerves and into each other's spaces, your kids being at home instead of going to school, older teenagers being home instead of being in college. That all adds up to stress. And this is a matter of support and guidance. You can support your employees in being more motivated and engaged, provide them with guidance in adapting to working from home. There are many ways of doing that. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Effective communication. This is something that's really important for people to focus on. Virtual communication is difficult for people to get to when they're used to working in an office environment. Now, of course, what you need to do is have a collaboration software. I hope that if you have a virtual team, you very much need to have collaboration software like Trello, Asana, Slack, Microsoft Teams, things like that. In those collaboration softwares, the main way of communicating is textual. So text, messages, and so on, comments. The problem with text is that a lot of the subtext is lost. Things like body language, where how people are behaving. Are they behaving in an agitated way? Are they enclosed, defensive? Are they showing anxiety, concern, excitement on their face? That is all lost. And that's a big problem for judging people. And of course, tone of voice. If I say, I think Michael should take that project, or I think Michael should take that project, those two sentences mean very different things. But if I write them down, they mean the same thing. So there's going to be a lot more misunderstandings in written communication, virtual teams. This is a matter of training. This can be easily addressed through training employees, providing them with professional development on effective communication in virtual teams. Resolving conflicts. This is another area that you want to be thinking about. It's overlapping, but not the same at all as communication. Face-to-face interactions. There's many more opportunities to notice conflicts because you notice things like tone of voice, things like body language. Somebody has an anxious, worried face. You can notice problems, you can address them, nip them in the bud through hallway conversations, and so on. So that's much easier to do face-to-face in office interactions than in a virtual teams. You need to first notice problems and then resolve them. Resolving them takes effective communication, which is, of course, itself more difficult. So this is a big challenge. You want to train employees. This is a matter of training. Otherwise, you'll see more and more problems that are serious problems bubbling up, internal friction. This is not good. Cultivating trust. People don't think about this area as one important for virtual teams just because in the office environment, cultivating trust happens naturally. When people meet over the water cooler, in the break room, talk about their kids, what's been going on, their vacation plans, what they want to, the local sports ball team, everything like this. Build those relationships, cultivate trust. In virtual settings, that's not possible. I mean, there are many ways of creating venues. This is not a matter of training, but this is a matter of creating a venue to address this. So, for example, for a client who I helped transition to a virtual team, completely virtual team, what we did was we set up two venues, and so they used Trello as a collaboration software, and they had a card where you can use Slack and the channel in Slack. In Microsoft Teams, same thing. Asana, same thing, commenting, where everyone who was part of a team, so this was a company of about 700 employees, and they had teams of maybe about 6 to 10 with a supervisor. So each team had a card, or it would be a channel if you're going to use Slack, and in that channel every morning they essentially as clocking into work. So what they do was is they share about how they're feeling, their mood, what's been going on in their life recently that they would last couple of days that they would like to share with people, and one fun fact about themselves that most other team members, and one interesting fact that most other team members don't know. Finally, what they plan to work on that day. And then they respond to at least 3 other people who shared that day. That provides inherent sense of community building, connection, humanization, where you're human to each other. That's very important, and that's something that people greatly underestimate. And then we also have another card, separate one, where people can share throughout the day anything that they want, anything that they're in the mood to share. They can have chat, engage, and so on. So that provides the combination of policy, obligatory updates, and spontaneity, that freedom to share whatever they want. So that's a good combination. You want to think about something like that for your organization. Finally, accountability. This is something really important to think about as well, because in the office environment, supervisors have a natural way of holding people accountable, of walking around, checking how everyone's doing, checking if someone seems disengaged, frustrated, uncomfortable, and say, hey, what's up? What's going on? You have weekly meetings, you have all of those reports. So that's something that you can hold accountable. You can also hold peers accountable. You can pop into Mary's office and say, hey, Mary, where's that report you promised me yesterday? It's much harder to ignore you when you're standing in the office of in her office door than when you're sending a message on email or Trello, of course, or Asana, comment on Trello, message on Slack or something like that. It's much harder to ignore. For that, you can create structures to provide accountability. So for another company that I helped transition, what they did was they have teams set up, and they have a report structure that every week somebody reports up the chain of command to their supervisor on what they've been doing that week and what they spend their time on, approximately the areas, and then their numerical outcomes to the extent that they could, whether ranging from sales numbers to bugs fixed for the IT team, whatever. So things like this, they provide information, numerical things, or tickets resolved for the IT team, to be more clear. So IT support team. And then they also tag other people, you can do that, who are in the same team, and report to the same supervisor and say how helpful Mary has been, or how it will be better for Bob to improve in, let's say, respond to messages within 48 hours as opposed to, within a week, as Bob usually does. So that's a big problem, of course, in virtual teams. If you don't respond within at least 24 hours, that's really what you want to aim for. That provides both accountability up the chain of command and peer-to-peer accountability. And that's the kind of things you want to be thinking about in setting up accountability structures. So that's the internal business model. Now I want to launch a poll. So if you take a look at the polling options, and it's going to ask how well adapted is your internal organizational model. So those 6 areas that we just talked about, how well adapted is it to the pandemic, to this virtual environment, to the reality of what we're facing? So please go ahead and vote. This is the good progress in voting. We have 70% of the people voted. So please vote for the rest. We're at 89%, so just a few more people. Give 5 more seconds. All right. So take a look at the results. What we see is that about 33% have really well adapted structure. That's great. It's wonderful. So really well adapted. Oh, sorry to hear, Farid, that you missed that poll. So you can type in the chat your answer. But really well adapted would be 33%. So that's great. Most people, of course, 2/3 are not well adapted. They need about half, just over half, need some revisions to their internal business model. So you need some revisions in some areas to your internal business model. And of course, you can look back and see all of these areas, and there will be a recording available. And 14%, so the sizable number, needs some serious revisions required. So that's another thing for you to be thinking about, serious revisions required. Good, stop sharing the results. And we'll answer all the questions at the end of this section. So just so you know. Great. Let's go on to looking at the external business model. So this was the internal one. Let's look at the external one. Service delivery, you've got to think about that. Relationship building, managing disruptions, shifting norms, unknown unknowns, and outcompeting your competition. Those are the 6 important areas of adapting your external business model to virtual teams, to the pandemic. That's what you want to be thinking about. Service delivery. You want to transition your offerings as much as possible to virtual, or of course socially distanced, but a lot of the socially distanced is highly problematic, because if you're still in the same office and spend more than really several minutes, more than 15 minutes in an enclosed space, you're putting yourself in danger, even if you're 10 feet apart, if somebody has COVID-19. So if you can get if you can get a large outdoor space, that's it might be a potential, but you want to do virtual as much as possible. And some will find it easier than others. Some will find it more difficult. All of my in-person gigs were canceled. So I do a lot of speaking and training and coaching and consulting, which those are not done if face-to-face anymore. So those were all canceled. So I'm transitioning all of mine to virtual, whether speaking like this, whether trainings, and this is kind of in between. Training would be more like half a day, full day, whether consulting, coaching, all of that is transitioned online right now, virtual. And you want to be thinking about how you can do that. It's somewhat harder for me than many others. I mean, some people can easily switch, let's say, their retail channels from in-person retail to online retail, things like this. And some will find it more hard than I do. The reality is that some businesses will find it much harder. And if your business is very much dependent on face-to-face interactions, let's say restaurants will not do well in this business if they don't have great takeout options. This is just the reality of the situation, because the pandemic, for the next moderate scenario, 2024, restaurants have a pretty low profit margin. So if you can do great takeout that pretty much ensures your ability to survive, so it's profitable, then that's going to be very difficult for you with your going back and forth, restrictions, and so on. And of course, lower capacity social distancing, that's going to be very hard for restaurants and other venues that are dependent on face-to-face interactions. Relationships. So you will want to be thinking about building those relationships virtually, whether establishing new relationships or cultivating existing ones. That's external stakeholders. So we talked about internal teams. And that includes clients, service providers, political leaders. Political leaders are especially important with the government stimulus, of course, going on right now. Prospects, investors, suppliers, all sorts of folks. And this is an area of professional development. You can get training in relationship building virtually. And I strongly encourage you to get that training. And as a trusted advisor, encourage the leaders in your company to provide training for everyone who deals with external stakeholders in virtual relationship building. Managing disruptions. This is something that many people don't think about. Even if they're protected themselves from, even if they have the really good, let's say their internal business model, very good, well prepared, maybe they think that their external business model is mostly well prepared or very well prepared, they don't think about the fact that many of their external stakeholders are not nearly as prepared as they are. Most won't plan for the long-term disruptions of the pandemic. They are looking to get back to normal. They're falling into normalcy bias, hyperbolic discounting, planning fallacy. How many people are you seeing right now who are pushing to go back to normal, who are, have the attitude that, well, the restrictions are slightly loosened, therefore the pandemic is over. Hey, that is such a frequent sentiment that is so damaging, so harmful, and a number of your external stakeholders will have it. You need to protect yourself against them. You need to protect your company against them. You need to help your leaders protect the company from them, from their failures. That's very important. Shifting norms. This is something that we talked about a little bit already. After several years of these waves of patterns of restrictions and loosenings, we'll have very different habits, norms, values, desires. There's going to be a number of people who, I'm hearing from a number of my clients who, the leaders, the CEOs, COOs, people in the executive leadership, HR, the VPs who look at HR, they were initially pretty skeptical about virtual teams, just being honest. But then once people started working virtually, they found that, oh, this is not nearly as bad as they thought. We can actually do this. So a lot of people will not go back to the office anyway. A lot of large companies are completely planning to transition to hybrid structures with many more of the employees working virtually. In Columbus, Ohio, where I'm based, for example, Nationwide Insurance has already made a commitment to sell a number of its offices and transition a number of its employees to working virtually, which is great for that they're kind of ahead of the curve. And of course, a number of technology companies have done so, but not simply technology, but insurance companies, which are Nationwide is very old. So it's successfully able to do so. You want to anticipate these shifts and get ahead of them. And that's the way that you will survive and thrive in this pandemic, by anticipating and getting ahead of these shifts. Think about unknown unknowns. Now, the pandemic was not really an unknown. It might have been an unknown unknown to you, but it was a predictable disaster. There were a number of people who were predicting it, ranging from Bill Gates in the technology philanthropy space to various health experts. The CDC, WHO, they had pandemic preparedness response plans. Unfortunately, the CDC didn't carry its plan out very well, but the WHO did some good pandemic preparedness in addressing the situation. A number of people have predicted it. This was a predictable disaster, even though most people didn't anticipate and realize how bad it would be. You want to be able to scan your environment for these major potential disasters, whether associated with climate change, which we have more and more, like Hurricane Sandy, or, of course, other sorts of predictable disasters like the pandemic, things that are developing, things that you can see coming down the road, that really, if you do scan the environment, as the chief risk officer, a number of you are risk officers, risk management officers, that's something that you can notice. And a number of you who are not purely risk officers, let's say you're in audit or you're in IT, that's still part of your responsibility, your risk portfolio. You want to protect yourself against them. You want to protect your organization against them. There are various ways of doing so. We talked about protecting against the pandemic, but not everything can be predicted. Some things you just absolutely can't predict. Like, let's say the flood in Michigan. Sure, so some of our infrastructure is failing, but it's not easy to predict that there's a specific dam that will fail and that will flood your area. For that, you can maintain a cash insurance. So cash cushion will really help you. Compare what's happening with with Berkshire Hathaway and the airlines. Berkshire Hathaway has chosen to build up a large cash cushion. I mean, something like an 180 billion cash cushion in order to protect itself against potential risks and problems in this environment. Now, that was, of course, before the pandemic. By contrast, airlines had a great profit margin. Since the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis, they were really going great. It was wonderful for them, but they gave away their money overwhelmingly in buybacks to stakeholders. So buying back the stocks that people held to increase their stocks. That's a big problem. They didn't build up the cash cushion that they should have, and now they're going with their hats off to the government for bailouts. And realistically, the bailout will not be nearly sufficient to go through 2024. Might last them through the most very optimistic scenario. So you don't want to be in the situation of the airlines. You want to be in the situation of Berkshire Hathaway, which is able to now buy up companies for much cheaper than it would have otherwise. Finally, outcompeting your competition. Your leaders, this will be something that your leaders will be especially excited about, outcompeting the competition. The steps I shared, if you follow them, if you implement them, if you do what I'm talking about, they'll help you gain a major competitive advantage. Remember, many people will fail to adapt to the pandemic, including most of your competitors. This is the reality of the situation. They will fall into that normalcy bias. Now, if you take the steps, you will be protected against these problems, and then you can anticipate the opportunity. That's one of the shifting norms, shifting expectations, getting ahead of your stumbling competitors. This is great because it can enable you to take steps right now to seize market share. That's going to be one benefit. And then you can hire away good employees as they're stumbling. So this will be another poll. If you take a look at the polling option, I want to ask the same question as I asked for the internal business model, but for the external one. How well adapted is your external organizational model to the pandemic? Keeping all of that in mind, with the external stakeholders and so on, all of those problems, how well adapted is it to the pandemic? We have 70% of the people voted already, so let's get the rest voting. About 80% of the people voted. So let's finish up those voting. I'll give people another 5 seconds to vote. All right. Let's take a look at the results. So here we see a surprisingly even distribution. We see that 19% of the people are really well adapted. So 19% doing really well. They're excellent. They're great. So about 1/5. Then most people, 3/5, require serious revisions. Are somewhat prepared. So they require some revisions, not super serious ones to the external business model. So you want to be thinking about those revisions based on the 6 areas that I outlined, and what kind of revisions are going to be required, what kind of revisions are going to be effective, and how you can essentially persuade the stakeholders, internal stakeholders in the organization to do them. And of course, it's going to be much more the case for the people with serious revisions. So 20% of the people who have serious revisions, so 1/5, that's something that you really need to be thinking about, how to get those serious revisions into your external organizational model. All right. Let's take a look at planning. So we talked about how planning for the pandemic, we talked about adapting. Now we're talking a little bit more about the planning going forward. Long-term plans, not the typical plan that will go awry, but something that you can actually effectively use to plan and adapt to the pandemic, to plan for the pandemic. First, think about the various possible futures that you're facing. Not that single ideal future that comes with a typical strategic plan, but a variety of futures. What might you be facing? and then invest resources accordingly to these variety of futures. Now, the main thing with the pandemic, as we said, that the way that it will be addressed is through a vaccine. So the optimistic scenario for all of us as a society and for your organization in particular is to have the vaccine widely available by 2022. Then moderate, widely available by 2024, pessimistic, widely available by 2027. Those are the possible futures. That's the reality of the future. And you can, of course, adapt it to your needs, depending on your organization, your context, but that's kind of a broad, something that's widely applicable to everyone, and you'll be pretty well off if that's the kind of planning that you orient toward. Think about 5 years out. Where will you be? Where will your organization be in each of these futures? Imagine what your business would look like, what your organizational model would look like in that future, 5 years from now. Each of these scenarios. So think about the optimistic one, think about the moderate one, and think about the pessimistic one, and plan all of these things out. So go through them, plan them out. As part of planning them out, think about what problems might be the case for you in each of those scenarios, and think of ways to address them in advance. So if some of you are, let's say, if you have issues with your supply chains, if you're anticipating that some of your external stakeholders, those supply chains, that they will be disrupted, maybe you can move your supply chains more regionally. Or maybe you're anticipating that some of your teammates will not make the successful transition to virtual teams, then maybe you can keep that in mind right now and be prepared to hire some people who would be, make sure to make virtual hires. So starting right now, where a number of tech companies are already doing that quite successfully. Make a plan to address them if these problems arise in a way that you don't expect. So what kind of, some things that you can't expect, I mean, you can definitely expect that some of your employees won't make the transition successfully. That's just the reality of the situation. Some people are constitutionally incapable of working virtually, or their house might not be set up in such a way that it's at all possible for them to do so. So that's something you can definitely expect and take steps to head these problems off by hiring other people who are a better fit. And of course, trying to provide professional development for everyone in making sure that they can adapt to the situation, but some of them just won't, and that's something you have to face. You can make a plan to address other problems that you are not sure will come up. Then the opportunities, same thing that you want to be thinking about, list possible opportunities in each of these scenarios, optimistic one, moderate, and pessimistic, and think of ways to bring them about. So for example, one of the opportunities that you might face is that in both the optimistic one and the moderate one, as well as the pessimistic one, in all of those scenarios, there will be a number of competitors who will not realize how bad it will be, because there's so many of them who think the pandemic will blow over in a few months. Maybe, the virus will burn out in the summer. It won't, but that's what they think. So that's something that you can take advantage of, and you can help your leaders take advantage of this. They'll especially appreciate this, they're kind of competition oriented. You can approach prospects who you would like to have, who are currently working with your competitors, but who you would like to have as your clients, and tell them that, hey, by the way, Sam, we did steps A through F to be pandemic proof. So A through F. So if our client, if our competitor happens to stumble, and if they're not as pandemic proof as we are, we'd be very happy to provide you with these services. You can do that literally right now. Talk about the steps, approach those prospects and tell them that, and they'll remember you when the competitor stumbles, I can guarantee that. So that is a way of addressing some of the opportunities, bringing these opportunities about right now, or make a plan to seize them if they do occur. For example, a competitor that stumbles, you can hire away their employees. You shouldn't approach their employees right now, but you can have a cash cushion to hire them away. Think about the resources you need to take advantage of each of these opportunities and address the problems in each of these scenarios. Money, time, information, social capital, strategic planning. When you make a plan, and that refers to making a plan right now to take advantage of opportunities and address problems. And reserve sufficient resources for the pessimistic scenario, ideally. This is what I'm advising my clients to do. Pessimistic scenario, you want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. If you can't, for the pessimistic scenario, at least the moderate scenario, that most likely scenario. Don't plan for the optimistic one. It's very tempting to, listen to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's saying, we hope that his statements are, we hope we'll have a vaccine within 12 to 18 months. that, reading between the lines, it's 18 months. So it's great. I hope so as well. But after you have the vaccine, you need at least 6 months with high level of government competence to produce and distribute a vaccine. So that's the most optimistic scenarios by early 2022, and that's less than 5% chance likelihood. And I'm sure he knows that. And a number of other experts who are in a less politically endangered situation are saying that it's incredibly optimistic to think that you'll have a vaccine that's approved and mass produced and distributed by the beginning of 2022, end of 2021. And then think about the information. What kind of information would lead you to understand that you're heading toward one course versus another course versus another course? So if you're hearing you want to don't follow the hype of individual companies and reporters who are just looking for clickbaity information about, hey, this vaccine trial is working out great. That's not the kind of information you're looking for. You're looking for unbiased sources that would evaluate some meta-analysis of a number of studies, and that would see the meta-analysis is one that analyzes and compares a number of studies. That's one source that would be reliable. Other sources are people who are heavily involved but not financially don't get financial benefit from a vaccine. So people, let's say, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they are not going to get a cent if there's a successful vaccine. They're just spending their money, a lot of it, Bill Gates, to get a vaccine out as quickly as possible. So looking at his analysis can be a good source of information. He's saying, we're optimistically we'll have a vaccine in 18 months. Monitor this information closely and adjust your plans accordingly to the information that you get. And then execute, execute, execute. So additional resources for the event are available at tinyurl.com/de-event. You can have a free coaching session with me and 2 chapters from my forthcoming book, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So just go to tinyurl.com/de-event, put in your information to get free coaching session and 2 chapters from my forthcoming book. All right, so that's what I wanted to share. Now we'll have the poll on who would wish to get credit. Before we go on to the Q&A, we'll have a poll question on who wants to get credit for the second half of the session. So please take a look in order to get credit for the second half of the section. So about 80% of the people voted. Give folks another 10 seconds. See, 87% of the people voted. All right, great. So, and polling. Now at this point, we'll go on to questions. So we have formally 10 minutes for questions. I'm happy to stay on and answer more questions if people have more questions.
So Dr. Jaspersky, we have a question for Stuart. He's asked, do you see sharing business office space by creating office space time shifts or alternating days when staff reports into the office locations, parentheses, hoteling?
Yes, so thank you for the question, Stuart. That is not going to be that great because you're still having people in the same space. The idea that people share office space by creating time shifts and so on, the idea is to increase social distancing. That is the point of doing so. That's nice if you want to spend 15 minutes in that space. But if you're spending a shift there, shift is 8 hours, even if it's half a shift, 4 hours, right? Everyone in that shift will have enough time for their air to circulate to everyone else. So if anyone is asymptomatic with COVID-19, they will get a bunch of their coworkers infected. That is not a good idea. That is not something that you should go toward if you want to protect people from COVID-19. This is why I'm very strongly encouraging not having those sorts of arrangements and having instead the virtual teams. That's the ideal environment. Now, if you do need for some reason for someone to be in the office, the only safe way to do that is to have completely closed office doors. Completely closed office doors that are sealed, air sealed. There's definitely ways to do that. So there are companies that are, of course, providing that service. And I'm not getting a cut of any of them. Just being very honest and clear, those companies, they can air seal doors. That way, you're not getting viral load that's in the air in the hallways. And if you are spend very little time in the hallways, that works. You also want to be especially careful about using bathrooms. So there's extensive evidence that flushing a bathroom actually puts up a whole load of viral particles into the air. So if you can be very careful about using public bathrooms, and that's another problem. So that's something for you to be thinking about. Great.
We have a second question from Reza. Gleb, what is your view on the airline industry?
The airline industry will not do well. So I mentioned that they're not even well set up for this lasting through 2022. I'd be not surprised at all if there ends up being a merger of one of the airlines where one of them is going to be doing so poorly that they'll need to be bought out by another that will have money, for example, from the government or from an investor. So that's kind of institutionally, they're not doing well. That's not a good business to be in. This is a big problem for airline industries. So that's kind of on the one hand, from the industrial perspective. From the individual perspective, you want to avoid traveling in airplanes. This is one of the best ways of getting COVID-19. Being stuck in an enclosed space for 2 to 6 hours, depending if you're doing transatlantic flight, not transatlantic, but transcoastal flight. We don't have transatlantic flights right now mostly, but transcoastal flights, from New York to LA, that's 6 hours. Or, if you're going from New York to somewhere nearby, it's still something like 2 hours time in the airplane from getting on to getting off. That everyone's there will circulate to everyone else. So there's going to be, if somebody has COVID-19 and they're symptomatic, you have a serious chance of getting COVID-19 if you're flying in an airplane. So people are rightly not flying in airplanes, regardless of the social distancing, regardless of wearing masks. That's even if you wear a mask, you still have some air escaping from it. So not great.
And we have a question from Duraj. What kind of incentives or legal framework do you see as forthcoming or imperative from governments to promote and protect planning for the new abnormal of the COVID-19 CV pandemic?
Yeah, so this is going to be important it would be great if the government has clear communication and clear guidelines about restrictions to provide predictability. That right now, one of the biggest failures, of the governments has been failing to be honest about the reality of the situation, where they say something like, we're going to shut down for a week. If you remember the early shutdowns, we're going to shut down for a week and see what happens. We're going to shut down, for another week. We'll extend this to the, end of April. We'll extend this to mid-May. That created very bad expectations, where people expected COVID-19 to be over by the end of the shutdown, in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month or 2 months. Instead, what the government should have done is say that optimistically, COVID-19 will be dealt with when we have a vaccine by the beginning of 2022, widely available. But, it might be until 24, 27, something like that. That would be a realistic scenario. And then they would say that, hey, in order to address it effectively, the only things we have is restrictions and loosenings. Here is what we'll do with our restrictions and loosenings. When we see cases hit this number in this area with this rate of increase or decrease, we'll loosen restrictions in this way. When we have an increase, we'll tighten restrictions. The best thing they can do is provide predictability for businesses, because right now so many are thinking that things are over and they're going ahead as though they can go back to normal, that is going to devastate economies going forward, where these businesses will be stumbled. They'll be forced to close. A number of them will not simply lose money, they'll go bankrupt because they don't have the right anticipation of what the future will look like, and they're not making the right decisions about what the future will look like. So the best thing that governments can do is provide that predictability and clarity about what will happen going forward. And that's been one of the big areas of weaknesses, of course. And we're not even talking about testing and planning. All of those things are important. But here we're not talking about testing, we're not talking about personal protective equipment, but specifically for adaptation and planning, those numbers, the anticipated future, and how the government is making its decisions so that business leaders, organizational leaders can predict about what will happen in the future. Other questions? What's your take on universities and colleges opening in the near future? Karen asked. Well, I mean, I presume you mean face-to-face opening, because they've certainly been open virtually. What my take is that a number of them will dither and they will hope that they can open for the fall semester. They will, because they get a lot of money for opening, right? That is going to be pretty tough. Now, fortunately, I'm really glad that the largest university system in this country had the cojones to say that we are going to be closed for the fall semester. They provide, and them saying that provides cover for pretty much all other colleges and universities to say the same thing. So I think that most will not be open for the fall semester, and the ones that are open will have some, if the legal protections aren't passed, they'll have some legal repercussions, but even more just as problematically, they'll have reputational repercussions when students get sick, and that will be a big problem. When faculty get sick, and that will be a big problem, that they will be in trouble of various sorts. So I think most will probably take the smart course and not open up for the fall semester, even though they're kind of dithering right now. More broadly, the universities area, sector, higher education, and by the way, this is a sector I spent 15 years in myself, so I'm very empathetic to this sector. I have a lot of love and respect for academics. I mean, I was one. Obviously, this is something I really care about, but it's going to be really quite a bit damaged by COVID-19, because there will be much broader transition to virtual education. And what happens with virtual education is that, of course, you need less colleges, because professors will be able to teach larger courses with various sorts of assistance and support. You'll have one professor supervising a number of graduate assistants who will be teaching a large course, and they will gather. So the most prestigious universities will gather more of the students, whereas regional colleges, private liberal arts colleges, they'll really lose out in this transition just because of the reality of the situation. I mean, the essence of the private liberal arts college experience is that face-to-face communal bonding. That will not happen. The reason that students go to regional colleges as opposed to getting an online degree is that face-to-face bonding. That will not happen until, at least, realistically speaking, early 2022, even though some might open up and they'll be in a tough space if they do earlier. Most will not. The risk is going to be too great, I think. So that's going to be a really tough experience. I mean, realistically, through early 2024, optimistically through early 22, that's going to be very tough. Thank you, Karen. Other folks?
It's 3 o'clock. So Dr. Suppression, thanks for presenting. I know you're an extremely busy guy, and you're presenting throughout the whole country, and we were so fortunate to have you present for us. It's just ridiculous. And I'm so happy that you're with us today. And I've seen great comments from everybody who attended. So for anyone who's attended this session, please email education@isacany.org if you have further questions. I see some people texting me here. I'll try and answer those questions, but if I don't get the chance to answer those questions, please email to that email address, and we'll try to get through the questions then. So Dr. Kaspersky, can you leave this session on so I can finish up here
Sure, happy
the boxes?
To.
And I think if hopefully all you enjoyed the session today, and definitely Memorial Day is coming, so it's gonna be a long weekend. So definitely enjoy the weekend. And Dr. Kaspersky, thanks again.
Thank you very much, everyone. You have a great day. And
thanks.
Again, if you want more resources, you have the tinyurl.com/JE-event. Bye-bye.
Yes. So basically, some of you did opt